said, are live streamed on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. SAS live events are recorded and archived, and the recordings will be posted on the above platforms. And of course, have fun. And basically, thank you for joining us. So now I am going to turn it over to our lovely host, Tine Rassalle, to get started with the event. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thank you for that, Lauren. I hope you can see me, as I cannot see what the audience sees. So I hope all the technology is working. That being said, this is how event is going to go. So I will first introduce myself a little bit, and then I will introduce the speaker of today, Dr. Bart Ehrman. I have prepared some questions for him on his latest book and also on his career. So for about 20 minutes, I will ask certain questions of him on that topic. And then we will have the rest of the time, so about 35 minutes for audience questions for Dr. Ehrman on his life, on his research, on his interest in the ancient world, and on his book. Please feel free to put them in the chat. There is chat available on YouTube, on Twitch, and on Facebook. And the chat questions will be moderated by Lauren, who will forward them to me. And so I will be able to ask them live to Professor Ehrman once I am done with my kind of preliminary questions. So you can start typing in questions as soon as you want, and then we will get to them in the second part of this event. And if you have any questions for me, you can put them in the chat too. So hi, I'm Tine. I am a PhD candidate at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm in the Religious Studies department, and I'm an archaeologist. I call myself a biblical archaeologist, even though that has kind of a negative connotation, but it's a term by which I mean I study the material culture of ancient Judaism and early Christianity in the Middle East. And so every summer, I normally go excavating in Israel, where I excavate ancient sites from the Jewish community. I've been involved in an excavation project called Horvat Kur for about 10 years now already, maybe more, where I'm the field supervisor, and it's a small Byzantine village where we found an ancient synagogue. And so every year we go there and excavate and try to reconstruct how the landscape looked like in the time, let's say between 200 and 700, and try to see how ancient villages worked at that time. So that's kind of my passion. I'm almost finished at Chapel Hill, so hopefully I will get my doctorate soon, but we are working on that. COVID has made my plans a little more difficult, to say the least, but we're working on it. And so when I was asked if I knew any authors that I wanted to bring into SASA and hear their perspective on the ancient world, I thought about Professor Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is a professor in my department, because he has written a lot of books that are open to a general public. And I think everybody, no matter what kind of background or lack of knowledge you have, will be able to enjoy his books. And I thought we would bring him on and he could say a little bit more about his work and why he is writing for a popular, for a general audience. So let me introduce our speaker. So we'll be talking with Dr. Bart Ehrman today, who is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies in my department, as I said, at Chapel Hill. Dr. Ehrman grew up in Kansas, and he studied at the Moody Bible Institute and also at Wheaton College. He received his MDiv, which is a master's in divinity, and his PhD from Princeton. His research mainly focuses on textual criticism of the New Testament, which is a complicated word to say. He's basically studying the ancient manuscripts of the Bible to try to reconstruct the original texts of the Bible, or to at least try to understand the historical world of the ancient authors who wrote those texts. Dr. Ehrman has written and edited over 30 books in his career, including Misquoting Jesus, How Jesus Became God, Forged, and The Triumph of Christianity. He also wrote a college-level textbook as a sort of introduction to the New Testament, which is used by hundreds of universities, literally in the US, to teach about the New Testament. And I also use it in my own class whenever I teach the New Testament. So it's a very popular textbook. In his works, he mainly focuses on the so-called early Christian movements, from the time of Jesus to Constantine the Great, which is about around 300 CE, looking at that movement from a historical perspective. His latest book, Heaven and Hell, which, as you can see, I have here, A History of the Afterlife, is an exploration of the views of what happens to you when you die, according to the people living in the ancient world. In the book, he gives examples of the afterlife as seen by the ancient Greeks, Romans, Jews, and Christians. And he shows that even though Jesus never mentions a heaven and a hell, it did become the standard view for Christians up until today. So, Professor Dr. Ehrman, welcome.
Well, thank you for having me.
Would you like to add anything to that elaborate introduction I gave?
Well, I'll just say something about, well, a couple of things. One is, thank you for having me, first of all, and I really appreciate it. It's a great organization, and I'm glad you're doing what you're doing, because understanding history is extremely important for those of us who want to live in the present. And ancient history can teach us a lot of lessons, and it's an extremely important field. So I'm really pleased with what you're all doing on SASA. And I do write different kinds of books. And so let me just say, with respect to this book, that I'm doing on this book what I've done with a couple of other books, which is I've written this popular book, which is at a general level for general readers who don't have a lot of expertise in, ancient Greek philosophy or in the Hebrew Bible or in, third century Christianity. You don't have to have expertise in this to follow this book. So this book came out at the end of March, and now I'm working on another book it's a scholarly book. An academic book, which is sometimes what I'll do. I write on a similar topic, but a book for a regular audience, and then a book for irregular scholars. And so that's what I'm working on now, which is a much harder, detailed sort of book. This popular book. The reason I wrote it was, I had several reasons. For one thing, I think the afterlife is a really interesting question. It's obviously interesting to people generally because they want to know what's going to happen to me when I die. Of course, and I don't know. So I'm not going to answer it. I'm not going to tell you what's going to happen. I have no idea. So, I have an idea, but it's I'm not an expert. What happens? The experts are dead. And so I can't help you there, but I can talk about where ideas came from. And the thesis of this book is that the modern view, at least in America, and probably for most people throughout the Christian world, the most popular view is that you die and your soul, your body disintegrates, but your soul goes to heaven or hell. It's interesting that in America, even though a lot of skepticism in America today, growth of atheism and agnosticism, still 7 out of 10 people in America believe that there's a literal heaven that your soul goes to when you die. And 6 out of 10 believe there's a literal hell that your soul might go to when it dies. 6 out of 10 believe in a literal hell. And the thesis of my book is that neither heaven nor hell, the idea that you die and your soul goes to one place or another, neither one is taught in the Old Testament, and it's not what Jesus taught. And so the question is, well, where'd it come from? And so I do a very long sketch that would be of interest to history buffs, going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, to the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible, to the later parts of Judaism, into the historical Jesus, the New Testament Christianity, and up into the 4th or 5th Christian century. So it's sketching where these ideas of heaven and hell came from historically, quite apart from what a person believes. Where did these ideas come from? And so that's what the book is about.
Great. So let's start at the beginning. You say that Jesus does not mention a heaven and hell. What is it that he believed in and that he preached?
Yeah, this comes as a big shocker for most people. Are you kidding? Jesus, of course, he taught in heaven and hell. And part of the problem is when you read the New Testament translated into English, it certainly sounds like he teaches about heaven and hell, because he talks about hell and he talks about heaven, the kingdom of heaven, and he's going to hell. It's like, whoa, of course he does. The problem is that the Greek words that are talked about there are not what we think of as heaven and hell. Jesus, like other Jews in his day, did not believe that the human being was separated into body and soul. Which most people think, you got a soul inside and you got your body that's there. Your body dies, your soul lives on. Ancient Jews didn't think that. Ancient Jews thought that the soul, what we call the soul, is more like your breath. When even we think, when you die, you stop breathing. But we don't think that the breath goes anywhere. Like it doesn't exist. It just stops. You stop. That's what ancient Jews thought about the human, is when they stop breathing, that was it. So the soul doesn't live afterwards. So the soul can't go to heaven or hell because there's no soul that it can exist separately. So what Jesus and people like him in his day thought was that there is going to be an eternal life, but it doesn't come when you die. What's going to happen is at the end of time, at the end of history, God is going to destroy the wretched world that we live in now and bring in a new world in which those who are righteous will live forever in their bodies. God is going to raise people from the dead. It's not that their souls will live on. Their bodies will be reconstituted, brought back to earth. So this is the resurrection of the dead, and eternal life will be lived here on earth in the body. Those who are on God's side will enter into this new kingdom, as opposed to this wretched kingdom we're living in now. There'll be a new kingdom that's controlled by God instead of the forces of evil, and his people will reside in it. Those who have opposed God, who have triumphed in this world, the forces of evil are controlling this world for Jesus and others like him. And so that's why people who are corrupt have so much power and wealth, because they're on the sides of the forces of evil. But God's going to take care of that. And when this kingdom of God comes, he's going to wipe out everybody else. So the people who are evil are going to be destroyed for all time. They won't be tortured forever. They'll be destroyed, but those on God's side will live forever in their bodies. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, that's fine. Because you talk in the book about how this is sort of a retribution system. It's sort of an idea that came up when people were seeing injustice happening on earth. And they were like, well, good people are poor and bad people have all the power and all the money. This is not fair. Surely there must be something in the afterlife to rectify this injustice. And that's where the idea came from.
Yeah, so it was a problem in both. So in Western culture, I mean, if roughly, if you think in terms of kind of sort of Greek civilization that came into the Roman Empire that influenced everything, and then you get Christian culture that came out of Judaism, the oldest form of Greek views of afterlife that you can find in the writings of Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey. The view there is that everybody gets treated the same after they die. They just go to Hades, and it's there. You don't have a body. You're a shadow of your former existence. You've got no power. There's nothing to enjoy. You're just kind of bored forever. Down and everybody has that. And the ancient Hebrews had a similar idea, is that you die and that's kind of the end of the story. And, there's nothing, that's it. And in both civilizations independently, I argue, what ends up happening is people start saying, well, that's not fair. And so by the time you get to Plato, several hundred years after Homer, you have an idea that when you die, you get rewarded or punished. And in the latest form of Judaism within the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Daniel, you also have the idea that there are rewards and punishments. The difference is that Plato believed that the soul was independent of the body. So Plato believed the soul lived on forever. Jesus believed that the body and soul were one thing. And so the only way to have eternal life is the body to be raised from the dead.
Right.
And so you have the immortality of the soul for the Greeks, and you have the resurrection of the body for Jesus. And what you end up in Christianity is an amalgamation of the two. Mm-hmm. So that Christians now actually believe what Plato believed, not what Jesus did, that the soul lives on forever, and yet they still confess that there's going to be a future resurrection. So it's combining the two.
Right.
Both of them are driven by justice, though. The issue of it's not fair, and surely if there's God's in control or God in control, it's got to be fair.
Right. So do you think that when there was more justice in the world, this idea would have never developed?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's right. That's right. Like if the world were fair, we wouldn't worry about like how it's going to be straightened out in the afterlife. You say, yeah, that's pretty good now. Thanks. Thanks, God. You took care of that. This schmuck is just having a terrible time with his life. And, I'm living in a mansion because I'm a good guy. Yeah. Yeah. If the wicked were punished and the righteous were rewarded in this life, I doubt if you'd ever have an afterlife ever develop. But of course, in human history, it's never been that way.
Right.
It's never
Right.
been that way.
So you just said that Jesus believed that that at the end of times, the bodies would be resurrected and there would be a kingdom on earth. While nowadays, we don't believe that anymore. We don't think that there's an intermediate period that we're going to be in a place somewhere. And then at some point, we will all be resurrected. Or are there Christians who still believe that?
Well, Christians still confess that even though they don't realize they do. So in a number of Christian churches today, still people say the Nicene Creed, for example. They say one of the ancient creeds. And in the creed, it says explicitly, I believe in the resurrection of the dead. That's referring to bodies coming back to life. And so Christians technically believe that your soul goes to heaven until Judgment Day. And on Judgment Day, there's a resurrection and you come back into your body. Although when you most of your Christian friends don't believe that, but that's still the standard Christian, it's supposed to be the standard Christian belief.
Right. What about purgatory? Is that the place where you are in between?
No, that's what people think it is, but it's not what it is. So purgatory, yeah, it's not so much an ancient doctrine, actually. I talk about it in my book. I actually have this whole section on purgatory where the term purgatory was not invented until the 12th century of the Common Era. And it didn't become an official Roman Catholic doctrine until the 13th century. So it's for 1,300 years, 1,200 years, Christians didn't have this idea of a purgatory. Although in my book, I talk about the early roots of purgatory in the early Christian tradition. Purgatory is, the way purgatory works is it's a place for people who are eventually going to go to heaven, but they have to pay for their sins first. Because, it's also not fair that somebody is a real saint, a Mother Teresa type, and then someone else is kind of your run-of-the-mill Christians who's basically a schmuck, but they believe in Jesus. It's not right that they both get the same reward, and the schmuck has to pay, right? And so purgatory developed as a way to have people still pay for the sins, but are allowed into heaven. But that's only for the people who are bound for heaven. The people who are bound for hell, they're stuck there forever still in the purgatory system. And so you end up then, by the time Dante, of course, people are most familiar with it from Dante, but you've got the Inferno, and then you've got the Purgatorio, and then you've got the three levels.
So there are different layers of punishment. It's more nuanced. Some people get a little bit of punishment. Some people get more punishment.
Yeah, purgatory works that way. Hell doesn't work that way. The Paradiso doesn't work that way. In paradise, there might be layers, but it's all good. You're not paying for your sins. But in purgatory, it depends how bad you were, and so there are different periods and different punishments depending on how bad you were, as long as you also are going to be eventually rewarded. So some people will be down there for 100,000 years, and some maybe will get by with 5,000. It's actually not down there, it's up there. Purgatory is up there. Yeah.
Nice. So you also talk about the book about the apocalypse and apocalyptic movements. Can you explain that concept a little bit better?
Yeah, so the apocalypse, the apocalyptic movement is the technical term for what I was describing about Jesus, the technical modern scholarly term. Jesus and people like him didn't call themselves apocalypticists, but that's what modern people would call them. And so the idea of apocalypticism, the word apocalypse is it's a Greek word. The corresponding word in Latin is revelatio, so revelation. And so the term apocalypse and revelation both mean the revealing of something or the unveiling of something. And the way it worked within Judaism was this: that in most of the Old Testament, when you read the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Old Testament, most of it holds to this view that you and I just agreed doesn't really happen that much, which is that if you're on God's side, he will reward you. And most of the authors of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, weren't really talking so much about individuals. They're talking about the nation of Israel. If the nation of Israel will obey God, he will defend them, he will make them prosper, and it'll be good. And so the prophets in the Old Testament had to explain, well, why isn't it going so well for us here? Why do we have economic disaster? Why are we having a famine? Why is there an epidemic? Why are we being destroyed by the Assyrians? I thought God was on our side. Why are they beating us up? And so the prophets said, consistent. I'm talking about all the prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Amos. Just name your prophet. They all said, it's because you sinned and God's punishing you. If you'll stop sinning, it'll be okay. And so that went on for hundreds of years until finally, a couple hundred years before, 250 years before Jesus, some thinkers start saying, we are doing our best here. And we are being punished by people precisely for doing what God told us to do. We're circumcising our babies. We're keeping our kosher food laws. We're worshiping him in the temple. We're observing the Sabbath. We're doing the things we're supposed to do. And we have people who are persecuting us for it. We're suffering because we're righteous. That doesn't work in the view of the prophets. And so they developed this idea that what's going on is that God actually has enemies in the world, supernatural enemies, not just human enemies, but supernatural enemies who are causing the suffering. And this world right now is controlled by these forces of evil, but God's letting it go for a while, but he's going to intervene and destroy these forces of evil. And when he does that, there'll be a cataclysmic break in history. So it's not that like we're going to improve over time. We're not going to make things better. It's going to get worse because you've got the devil and you've got demons. These are late constructions in Judaism. Most in the Hebrew Bible, you don't have a devil and you don't have demons and things like to develop. You start getting these as the powers of evil. God's going to destroy them in some kind of cataclysmic event where history comes to an end and like we start all over again. And that's when the kingdom of God arrives. That's when people are raised from the dead, because God's going to reward the people who are on his side, not just the people alive at the time, but even people who died before this. They're going to get rewarded. And that's where you get the idea of the resurrection of the dead then that Jesus subscribed to. So by the time of Jesus, this apocalyptic view was very popular in Judaism. It was a view that Jesus had, it's a view John the Baptist had, it's a view that your people at the Dead Sea Scrolls, assuming there were Essenes, they had. It's a view that the Apostle Paul had when he was a Jew, and it's a view the early Christians had. They didn't have any idea that your soul would go to heaven. Their idea was, we're going to be raised from the dead, and by the way, it's going to happen very soon. God is fed up with this world, and probably sometime next Thursday, it's going to happen. And so people will be raised from the dead.
So the apocalypse was something to look forward to. It is.
Oh my God, yeah.
Nowadays, with this brimstone, and we're all going to get killed. And
yeah, but even in some fundamentalist Christian circles, the idea is that the believers will be taken out of the world, and then everybody else will have hell to pay. And so they're kind of keeping this idea with a very modern twist to it. They of course think this has been the standard view all along, but it has not been the standard view all along. But so when fundamentalists talk about the rapture, that's what they're talking about, right, is being taken out of the world. So because then hell hits earth and the apocalypse comes, but they don't have to go through it.
Right. And so people throughout history have believed that the apocalypse is coming soon, right? And we have all these interpretations of Revelations, and yeah, it's going to happen when Hitler became in power, and it's going to happen in the year 2000. And even people are saying now the coronavirus is another plague, yeah, that is ravishing our world, and this is the onset of the apocalypse that is to come pretty soon now. This, yep, time. Right.
Yeah, this time. Yeah, no. So you can actually document that virtually every generation since the days of Jesus has said that it's going to happen in our day. And I wrote one of the first books I wrote for a trade audience was a book about the historical Jesus. And what I argued in the book was that that's what Jesus thought. That Jesus, in the Gospels, in the New Testament Gospels, Jesus tells his disciples, some of you standing here will not taste death before you see that the kingdom of God has come in power. Then he describes how the world's going to be destroyed. And he says, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. So the earliest Christians thought it was going to happen in their lifetime. Paul talks about it. It's coming before he's dead. And then, but then they died. And so people say, well, it's delayed for a while, but it's going to happen in our generation. And then it was delayed. Well, it's going to happen in our, and you can trace this thing all the way back and all the way forward. When I was in college in the 1970s, the best-selling book in English, outside of the Bible, the best-selling book in English was called The Late Great Planet Earth, which described, on the basis of a study of the book of Revelation, that described how Jesus was coming back and the world was going to come to the end by 1988 or by the end of the 1980s. Millions and millions of people bought it. Millions. I mean, way beyond the Da Vinci Code. Oh my God. No, yeah. It just didn't make the bestseller because, there was Christian people, but, what was the argument? Okay, I'll give you one of the arguments. I don't know how much more time we have, but this one will take me a minute, but that's all it's going to take. So, in the Gospels, Jesus says you should pay attention to, the disciples say, when's the end going to come? And Jesus says, pay attention to the fig tree. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, I tell you, when these things take place, the end is near. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place.
Right.
And so interpreters of the Bible, fundamentalist interpreters back in the 60s and 70s said, okay, so what does this mean about the fig tree putting forth its leaves? Well, in the Bible, elsewhere in the Bible, the fig tree is an image for the nation of Israel. So fig tree putting forth its leaves means it was dead over the winter, but it comes back to life. Okay, when did Israel come back to life? 1948. Yeah. Israel became a nation again in 1948. Okay, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. 1948 plus 40, bingo. It's got to be by 1988. So when I moved to Chapel Hill, there was a book that had 2 million copies in print that was called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Occur in 1988. And I got phone calls from newspapers in Chapel Hill saying, is Jesus really going to come back in September this year? Seriously. And I said, no. And I had a student whose parents literally sold the farm at UNC. Yeah. Because Jesus is coming back. And so,
Talk about why the ancient world is still important for modern people.
Boy, wow. Yeah, no, because people don't know how to interpret the Bible or other things, and so they're gullible. If you know some history, you're not nearly as gullible.
Wow, that's insane.
Yeah.
So another question that I had was, so you talk about all these different examples of a sort of afterlife that the ancients imagined. What to you was the most surprising or interesting idea about what happens in the afterlife that you discovered in your research?
In the research for this book, I wasn't surprised by too much about it, but I'll tell you the thing that I really, really kind of cordoned onto again, which I'd for a long time been really interested in. And it's the speech that Socrates gives on his trial when he's up for a capital crime. He's going, if he doesn't get through this trial, they're going to execute him. And it's recorded in Plato's dialogue, The Apology. The apology means a defense. And so this is actually his defense speech that he gives at that Socrates gives at his trial, as Plato reconstructed it. So Socrates, the jury is a little bit puzzled that Socrates isn't working harder to try and get off the hook. That he's not really doing much to defend himself. And Socrates says, yeah, I see that, you can't figure out why. He said, but I don't know why should I lie in order to get off the hook? Or why should I do something wrong to get off the hook? I don't think there's anything to be afraid of death. And he says, look, there are two possibilities of death. He said, either what happens is life kind of goes on after you're dead like it does now, which means like everybody will be there. So I'll be able to talk to Homer and to Hesiod and the great poets. And he said, and nothing Socrates like better than talking with people. And so he'll spend eternity talking to these brilliant minds. He said, oh my God, that'll be fantastic. And they say, look, if it's not that, what is it? It's going to be like a deep, dark sleep. You go to sleep and you don't wake up. And he said, nobody dislikes a long, dreamless sleep. We love it when we get that. And so what's there to be afraid of? You're going to be in a deep, dark sleep forever, which you love, or you're going to be talking to Homer and Hesiod and all the great, and so, yeah. So I think, and so I don't get very personal in the book. I get personal at the beginning and end just because I want people to see how interesting this is and how it was interesting for me personally. But on my personal, I mean, I think Socrates is right. I mean, personally, I think you just die and that's the end of the story. But if it's not that, I certainly don't believe in a God who's going to torture you for trillions of years and that's the beginning. Yeah, that's a good God for you. No, I don't. I just don't believe that. I think that you die and that's the end of the story. But if it's not, it's not. It's not going to be bad. There's nothing to be afraid of, and that's important. It's important because people shouldn't be afraid of death. They shouldn't.
Right.
We should not be afraid of death. And Socrates, okay, an ancient figure, he can teach us this.
Right. So you think that we should find comfort in whatever idea that we have about the afterlife? It should be one that comforts us and not one that scares us or makes us,
it can
so
cause a
afraid
lot of
to do anything wrong that
Yeah.
because we're going to get punished at some point.
Well, it's a very serious affair when parents start teaching their children about the ravages of hell.
Right.
It really can scar children for life. And I know adults as well who are just terrified, and it affects their lives. And you don't have to be terrified. So, when I write a popular book like this, it usually is it's meant to do two things. One is to convey historical information about antiquity. And the other thing is to show the relevance for us today. And for me, this is hugely relevant because, death is the thing people fear more than anything. Well, a lot of people fear dying more than they fear death these days. They don't, of course, you don't want to get old and decrepit, and you don't want to be a burden on people, and you don't want to be in pain. So people fear that too. But people fear death a lot. It's usually ranked as the number one thing people fear. And I think if you actually see where the ideas of heaven and hell came from, where you start realizing why the idea of hell developed historically, based on all sorts of historical contingencies, which I explain in the book. I explain how this view came into being, because it wasn't Jesus' view, it wasn't the Old Testament view. It was like, where did this thing come from? You realize, this is something somebody made up. I mean, it's not quite that easy, right? It's not somebody sat down and said, I think I'm going to dream something up. But it is. My original title for this book was going to be The Invention of Heaven and Hell. Mm-hmm. And I really do believe they're inventions, but by that I mean something specific, which is that, every idea that people hold today, but everything that people think today, every mathematical formula that people have today, every technology that we have today, every idea every economic system we have, there was a time when that thing did not exist. Mm-hmm. Right? The Pythagorean theorem did not exist before Pythagoras or whoever came up with it. I don't mean that it's not, of course it's true, but it was invented by somebody. Somebody came, because people didn't think at one point, and somebody did think it at a different point. So at some point, somebody came up with it. And the same with, democracy.
But to play devil's advocate, isn't it, some people would say, well, we only discovered that it existed. It's always been existing. Like just gravity has always been there. We just didn't have a theory for it. So maybe heaven and hell have always been there. We just didn't think about it yet.
That's right. And the difference is that with mathematical theorems and with physical law, there are ways to test and demonstrate them. And so when you see the history of it, which I'm interested in Newtonian physics and how Newton came up with his theories of gravity and such. When you see how it happened, then it makes sense how it happened, and then you can understand it better. I think the understanding of a scientific theorem can help you understand it better. And if you understand where heaven and hell came from, you can understand that better too. And in that case, these are not discoveries. Nobody's discovered heaven and hell. They came up with the idea. But people did come up with the idea that, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the square of the two sides. I mean, somebody did come up with that idea. Yes, it's true. There are a lot of things people invented that are true. I mean, somebody invented the automobile, and it really does work. But it doesn't mean they didn't invent it.
Right.
Invent actually, means, it comes from the Latin word invenio, which just means to come upon. Somebody came upon it.
Right. Why you cannot give fundamental proof for an existence of heaven and hell.
Well, you can't give any proof. I mean, people say they do, right? I talk about this a little bit in my book. I mean, I got interested in this topic. Actually, one of the reasons I wanted to do this topic, one of the reasons I write popular books, is because it gives me a chance to read things that otherwise I wouldn't. I'd like to read, but I'm just not going to take my time because I want to do my research. But I wanted to read about near-death experiences.
Yes.
And I thought, this will give me the excuse. And so I read 20 books on near-death experiences, and I read all this stuff and started, because I was wondering.
Topic in high school, I read so many books on that topic.
It's great, and it's, you can get, the thing is, you get both sides. You can get both sides, and then you can weigh them out. And because I was really puzzled, I don't understand, how can this work? And then, I came to realize how it worked, and thought, okay, so, but it's a scream. Some of these near-death experience books are just so, they aren't meant to be funny, but you just some guys wrapped up in the emergency room in a thermal blanket, and they're sticking thermometers in various parts of his body, and so, and then when he wakes up, he says that he realized that hell is hot, and the devils are sticking things in your body. It's like you didn't realize that he'd just been through this thing. It's like, oh my God. Okay.
Okay, at this point, I think we can open it up to questions from the audience and see what they have to say about this topic. So we have a question from somebody named Ariel, who asks, I'm particularly interested in the Jewish concept of Sheol or Shul, and how it evolved into purgatory, and how Gehennom evolved into hell within the Christian and later monotheistic context.
Great. It's a great question. And it gets back to what I was saying earlier, that in the English Bible, you do have words translated as hell, and they are never the words that mean hell. And so the question has two parts, one about Sheol, one about Gehenna, Ben Gehinnom is how it shows up first in the Hebrew Bible. So Sheol, when I started my book, when I said earlier, I don't learn that much when I do these trade books, because they're just kind of, but I learned this. I actually changed my complete view about what Sheol is. Got a major change for me. I used to think what most people think. In fact, I taught this for years and years. In fact, Tina, you probably heard me teach this to an undergraduate class once. I used to think that Sheol was kind of like the Greek Hades, the place that everybody went where they died. It's this kind of shadowy existence, and it's this nether world, and everybody's there, whether they're righteous or not, and they're kind of bored to death. Not to death. They're bored after death for all eternity. I came to think that it doesn't mean that in the Hebrew Bible. The word Sheol is not very common in the Hebrew Bible. It mainly appears in poetry, mainly in the book of Psalms. It is connected with death. And as you know, Tina, but maybe a lot of people don't know, in the Hebrew Bible, there's a lot of poetry, but Hebrew poetry doesn't work like kind of traditional English poetry. Like, in traditional English poetry, the rhymes, right? The rhyming schemes. And in Hebrew poetry, so like, if you're just starting out writing poetry, you rhyme the end of each word. It's a kind of pedantic way of doing it. There's good poetry like that too, by the way. But when you're in fifth grade, that's how you do it. You rhyme the words. Hebrew didn't rhyme the words. Hebrew rhymed ideas.
Right.
And so you'll have a two-liner. You have in the Psalms or Proverbs, you have all these two-liners, and the first line will say something, and the second line will either say exactly the same thing, or will say kind of the corollary, or it'll say something related to the first thing. And if it says the same thing, it's synonymous parallelism, saying the same thing synonymously. So you have one line that says something, like, those who follow the Lord are blessed, and happy are they who believe in God. Something you have something like that. Right? The first line says the same thing. They say the same thing. All right. Yes. Sheol shows up a lot in this Hebrew poetry like that, and the synonym is always words like pit, and grave, and death. I came to think that Sheol is not a place that people go to. It's just referring to the place you're buried. you cease to exist. You don't, your breath isn't in you anymore. You don't exist anymore. That's why you can't worship God in Sheol, according to the Psalms, because you don't exist. God doesn't remember you anymore, according to the Psalms, when you're in Sheol. Why? You're in your grave. You're dead. So Sheol, my view is Sheol is what ends up being reversed when apocalypticists come along and say, no, there's going to be a resurrection of the dead. It's not that you're just going to die, because that's not fair. God's going to raise you from the dead and you'll live forever then. That view is not what led to purgatory, in my view. In fact, I'm pretty sure about this one. Purgatory really rose out of the Christian tradition, and it had to do with how everybody could be rewarded the same in heaven and hell with nothing in between. And they started, no, there's got to be something in between, because not everybody's a pure saint or a pure sinner. There's got to be something in between. That's where purgatory came from later. The word about Gehenna, the thing about Gehenna is also interesting. This is the word that's Sheol is translated as hell in a number of Hebrew Bible translations. It's an awful translation, because it's not talking about what people mean today by hell, which is that your soul goes there. It's not, that isn't what it is. And Gehenna in the New Testament shows up on the lips of Jesus, and in English Bible translations, it also gets translated as hell, and that's terrible. You know, Jesus says things like, you know, if your right hand sins against you, lop it off, because it is better to enter into the kingdom of God maimed than to be thrown whole into hell. Oh, that sounds bad. Yeah, it doesn't mean hell. The word there is not hell. The word is Gehenna. Gehenna, as the questioner indicated, actually comes from the Old Testament. Gehenna is the word that developed out of this word, the Ben Gehinnom, the sons of the land of whatever. Hinnom was a personal name, a guy's name. He had some land, and so it was the Gehinnom. This land was a valley outside of Jerusalem.
Oh, right. It's the Hinnom Valley. Yes.
Yes, it's the Hinnom Valley. That's Gehenna. That's Gehenna. And so it's the southeast valley of Jerusalem.
Yes.
And the thing it got a very, very, very bad reputation in the Hebrew Bible, because that is where some Israelites practiced child sacrifice to the Canaanite god Moloch.
Right.
And so, you know, not every Israelite was a faithful worshiper of Yahweh, and some worshiped other gods. Moloch was one of these other gods, and allegedly child sacrifice was offered to Moloch in this place, in this valley.
That's where they throw children through the fire, right? Is that how
that's what ends up, the children are, so this Moloch is a fire god, and so they go through the fire. It later came to be said that this was a trash dump outside of Jerusalem. They burned trash there, but there's no evidence of that until like the 13th century or so. So it's like that's just a legend. But it was thought to be an awful place, because you have these bodies being burned there. And the idea is not that your soul is going to go to Gehenna, you know, that you'll be, you know, you're going to go to hell. The idea is that it's a desecrated place that is opposed to God. Down in the valley, you can look up and you can see the holy city where the temple is. God's living in the temple. This is the place that's forsaken of God. You don't want your body thrown in there. And part of it has to do with the ancient fear of not receiving a good burial. You know, one of the things most feared by people in antiquity, if you don't believe in an afterlife, not receiving having your corpse desecrated was an awful thought for people, far more than although today too. And so you're not just going to have your corpse unattended to, like rotting in the street. You're going to be tossed in this most godforsaken place on earth. For Jews, that was horrible. And so Jesus is saying, you know, you're better lop off your hand and enter into the kingdom of God that's coming than you are to be, you know, whole and be tossed into this pit. And so that's what he's talking about. And then eventually Gehenna ends up, people start talking about it being, you know, down there. It's a valley down there, and so it's where your soul goes. But that's not what Jesus was talking.
So it's a symbolic place. It was the literal place. It was the burial over there.
Well, Gehenna, no, they did throw bodies into Gehenna, so there's a literal place there. There's a place, and so so like if you're a real loser, they toss you into Gehenna. You don't want that, and so that develops then into the Christian idea that your soul will go to hell. But it's not what Jesus is talking about, the valley outside of Jerusalem.
Right. Interesting. That kind of shows how much background information you should have to read all these stories, right? Or you're completely misinterpreting all of these ancient texts.
You can't understand ancient texts generally, and the Bible specifically, without knowing something about the ancient context. And you can't just get it by reading the Bible. You can't. I mean,
Mm.
and so there are people who've read, I know people who've read the Bible 100 times, literally, have read the Bible 100 times. They really don't know the first thing about it because they know what the words are in it, but they don't
Right.
understand it because they don't. And if obviously, if you take something out of its context, you misunderstand it. And
Exactly.
so, you've got to have the context. And for that, you need to read more broadly than that. You need to either take courses where somebody can tell you, or you need to read books where they tell you, because otherwise, so yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's like when we would reference to a pop culture phenomenon or a TV show or something like that, 500 years later, they
Oh, yeah.
wouldn't know that we're making a pun or a reference if they had never seen that TV show.
No.
So it's important to understand what was going on around
Yeah.
this text and the historical context of that place to understand what they're referring to.
Yeah.
Great.
So, when I started teaching back in the mid 80s, Ronald Reagan was the president. And Reagan had what everyone thought about Reagan. I wasn't a big Reagan fan, but what everyone thought about it, he did have a sense of humor. Unlike some of his successors, but so he had a sense of humor. So he was doing a radio interview or something, and he thought the mic was off. And so the mic was live, and Reagan said, "I've just signed legislation that declares the Soviet Union illegal. The bombing begins in 2 minutes."
Oh, Jesus.
This was before the wall came down. This was like, the Soviet Union was a real enemy and a real threat. And he thought the mic was dead. It's like, oh my God. So if you don't know about the Cold War, and you don't know about Reagan, and you don't know about, like what's going on in the Soviet Union, like if this is just like something somebody says, oh, that's interesting. Oh my God, it was really serious. You've got to know the context to make sense of why that was very, very, very bad.
So somebody else asks, what do you say to people who do believe in heaven and hell?
Well, it really depends. I mean, I have a Christian background myself. I grew up Christian, and I went through a kind of a fundamentalist phase where I absolutely believed in heaven and hell. And so I know what that's like. I'm an agnostic, an atheist. I mean, I'm an atheist. I'm not a believer now. But I have no desire to like make other people atheists or to make them agnostics. I do have an interest in people being reasonable when whatever they think. There are a lot of unreasonable atheists who are just as bad as fundamentalists. They're fundamentalist atheists. I don't like that either. I think you should have a reasonable idea, and I think you ought to appreciate what other people think and respect what other people think, unless it causes harm. And I think some beliefs about heaven and hell can do harm, and I'm against those. Especially the teachings of hell, as we were talking about earlier. I really do think it could do a lot of psychological damage, and so it's bad. It can be bad. But people who believe in heaven, I don't try to talk them out of it. I mean, why? Why? My dear 93-year-old mother, I mean, she thinks she's going to die and she's going to see her husband. My dad died, 30 years ago or something. He's like,
Oh, yeah.
why should I tell her? No, actually, Mom, you're just going to dead. You won't, yeah. Why would I try to convince her of that? It's fine. She can believe that if she wants, but she shouldn't be scaring other people. And if you don't agree with me, you're going to go to hell, and boy, you're going to be tormented for a trillion years. It's like, no, don't do that. So I don't.
In with the next question that we got, somebody says, I've been physically to the valley. It's oddly beautiful. But then he says, it's so
I think they mean the Valley of Gehenna. Gehenna. Yeah.
The valley of death.
Yeah, Valley of Death. Yeah.
It's so interesting understanding the historical context of our theological beliefs. How do you think we can educate those that hold fundamentalist beliefs in a way that doesn't put them off or put them on the defensive?
Yeah. I used to have a real kind of sledgehammer approach to arguing with fundamentalists, where you like the way to convince them was kind of beat them over the head with a sledgehammer. And, after a long time doing that, I realized, that just doesn't work. And so my sense is that people are more willing to listen to you, whatever your point of view is. If you listen to them and appreciate what they're saying and try to understand where they're coming from, and explain why you don't agree with them in terms that are not offensive and not trying to make fun of them or to ridicule their views, but to take them seriously and to explain, why you don't think so. When it comes to hell, I think that the Christian idea has always had a problem. I mean, the way it worked historically, the way this idea of hell, heaven and hell developed, as I said earlier, is an amalgam between what Plato said and what the Christians said. And Plato thought the soul was immortal. You can kill the body, but you can't kill the soul. The soul is going to live forever. So when you die, your soul lives on. Christians picked up on that. The soul lives on and it's immortal. And the upside of that is that the followers of Jesus who started developing this view means they're going to live forever and they will be in paradise forever. And that'll be great. But the flip side of that is that if the soul is immortal, that means the punishment has to be forever. Right. And that creates the problem of justice again. It's just in a sense that the wicked, pay a price for their sins, for hurting others, for hurting other people. Sometimes, for torturing others, for whatever, they have to pay a price for that. There's got to be a price. But the thing is that if you've sinned for 20 years, and maybe you're not that bad, you're just kind of a run-of-the-mill sinner. Does it really make sense that you're going to have hot pieces of iron stuffed into your nose and your eyes for trillions of years? Why isn't it just for 20 years? And why isn't it just like, getting a hangnail and, like having, tight shoes for 20 years? Why is it like you're going to be tormented by devils in the lakes of fire and stuff? Really? I'm going to be in fire and that's just the beginning, by the way. When I say trillion years, it doesn't end. That's the beginning. It will never end. And is that fair for 20 years of being kind of a schmuck? No. It's not fair. And if people don't realize it's not fair, people say, well, yeah, but it's the justice of God. God is just and God is eternal. So his justice is eternal. So the penalty has to be eternal. But the penalty doesn't have to be eternal. He can make people suffer for 20 years and then they give them another chance and see how they do. By the way, in my book, the last chapter of my book, I talk about the Christian views that developed, Christian views, not just about purgatory, but about universal salvation.
Right.
In the early church, there were proponents of the idea of universal salvation, that everybody eventually gets saved. Some people have to pay for their sins, but in the end, God's not a monster. He's not a million times worse than Adolf Hitler. He's not. And these people just said, look, it just doesn't make sense anymore. It's an important stream of the Christian tradition. And the interesting thing is, it's a stream of the Christian tradition that is reasserting itself in significant ways today, even in the Bible-believing evangelical community. There are, I know scholars, Bible-believing evangelical scholars who defend the Christian faith. They're like professional apologists for traditional Christianity who do not believe in a literal hell. And the way they get around it is by saying, yeah, and they don't think the Bible teaches it. So they can get around it. Yeah,
because if we would think about all the different laws that you have to follow to make it into heaven and never sin in your life, how many people do you think actually make it into heaven?
Well, the Christian tradition had the answer to this that a lot of people really like a lot, which is that, you might be a sinner, but if you believe in Jesus, that's what gets you in. You don't get in by not sinning. And the line is actually a very interesting theological line that's been around since the New Testament, really. The line was, look, if you could get in on your own merits, there'd be no reason for Jesus to get himself crucified.
Right.
He could just tell you, look, shape up, right? That's a lot easier than being nailed to a cross for a while. And so he could just say, look, shape up. You know, if you shape up, you'll be fine. And by the way, that is what I think Jesus taught.
Mhm.
The historical Jesus, I think, said, repent and turn around so that you can enter into the kingdom of heaven. But then after his death, his followers start saying, yeah, that won't do it. You got to believe in Jesus. If you believe in Jesus, then you'll get in, and it doesn't matter how righteous you are. They did expect that if you believe in Jesus, you're not going to, go on like, carrying on the way you've been carrying on, whatever level you happen to be carrying that on. But they did expect that, you sort of shape up, but it was the death of Jesus that got you in, not your righteousness. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we're only a couple of minutes away from the end of this interview. So I would like to ask you, what is it about the ancient world that fascinates you so much? And why did you want to study this time period as a sort of pitch for SASA? Why is it important, or what attracts you to the ancient world to educate yourself on that topic?
What originally attracted me was the Bible, because I was a Bible believing Christian. I wanted to know more about the Bible. And the more I studied the Bible, the more I realized I had to really study the context, the historical, cultural context of the Bible. And so I learned Greek and I learned Hebrew. And then I realized a lot of early Christian texts were important too. So I learned Latin and I learned Coptic, and I learned these languages so I could read these texts. Then I learned French and German so I could read these texts. I wasn't raised in Western Europe like Tina here, who grew up knowing 29 languages or something. I grew up in Kansas. It's like I knew English. And so I had to learn all these languages. And so I got really interested but then the more I started reading about the context of the Bible, the New Testament especially, I got interested in Greek classics and in and other things in the ancient world, like the ancient Near East and Mesopotamian mythology. And oh my God, it's really interesting. Then I got interested in Greek philosophy and Plato. And you start reading this stuff, you realize these things are classics because they still speak to people today if people will just pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I would much prefer spending a half hour trying to read Homer in Greek, which is not easy for me because my Greek was biblical Greek from hundreds of years later, but I read Homer in Greek. I'd much rather do that than watch a sitcom. I mean,
Wow.
I just would. And like, I don't watch any sitcoms. I'd rather think about these really important ideas that come to us from the ancient world that are still relevant in ways that would make a big difference to how I live my life. And so I'm not saying everybody should be that interested in the ancient world, but they should be interested in the life of the mind. And the ancient world is a fantastic place to be because it is so rich. There are a few places richer than ancient Israel, ancient Greece, early Christianity. There's a lot of stuff there that's fantastic. And so I know SASA deals with lots of different areas, but that's where I am, and it absolutely transforms my life all the time.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman. This was fantastic. This was great. Thank you for coming on and putting in your time and effort to talk to us. And I think we are done with our time. So I will close it off. We will have another interview with a speaker, I believe, in December. So we look forward to having you there. Next week, I will be doing a expert Q&A panel on women in ancient Israel. So I hope that you can join us for that as well. And we will see you around. Thank you.